On the Laramie Plains in 1879, a Welsh stonemason began stacking limestone around his cabin. Not against it, around it. He left a narrow walkway between the wall and the logs, wide enough for a grown man to turn sideways and pass through. To every other settler on that bench, it looked like lunacy. A wall that did not touch the house. A fortress with a gap in it. A pen for animals he did not own. But Rhys Morgan was not trying to keep something in. He was building a place for the wind to lose. The first man to call him a fool was Caleb Wren, the county survey clerk, who rode past just after sunrise with 2 homesteaders at his back. Rhys had a limestone slab hanging from a block and tackle made from wagon chain. The slab weighed more than any one man should have tried to move. His boots were white with dust. His palms were torn open and blackened with grit. Wren reined up and stared at the half-circle of stone rising around the north side of the cabin. "What is that supposed to be?" he called. Rhys lowered the slab 1 inch at a time until it settled into the course beneath it. Then he stepped back, checked the lean of the wall, and said nothing. Wren laughed. "You know the house is over there, Morgan. You missed it by 2 feet. The 2 men behind him laughed, too. It was an easy joke, and the Plains rewarded easy jokes. By noon, the story had reached 3 claims and a freight camp. By nightfall, everyone between Crow Creek and the Medicine Bow Road had heard that the Welshman was building a stone wall around his cabin and leaving the cold a doorway. What they did not know was that the doorway was the design. Rhys Morgan had not come west as a farmer. He had come as a quarry hand, a waller, and a man who understood stone the way other men understood horses. In the limestone country above the River Dee, he had spent 26 years building walls without mortar. He knew that a stone wall was not a pile. It was a held argument. Every flat face had to answer the one beneath it. Every small wedge had to lock a larger piece in place. Every empty space had to be made harmless. And he knew something else. The wind did not steal warmth because it was cold. It stole warmth because it moved. The other settlers had learned winter from timber. They felled pine, notched corners, packed mud and grass between logs, and trusted thickness. A bigger log meant a better wall. A bigger fire meant a better night. Rhys had tried that once. His first winter on the Laramie Plains had been spent in a cabin that every neighbor called sound. The logs were straight. The roof was tight. The hearth drew well on calm evenings. Then December came. The wind arrived as if it had crossed 200 miles with nothing better to do than find the Morgan cabin and take it apart, one breath at a time. It came through the door sill. It came through the chinking. It came around the window frame with a thin, surgical hiss. At night, Rhys watched the flame of a tallow candle on the table lean east and stay there. It did not dance. It did not flutter. It pointed. A small yellow needle showing him exactly where his house was bleeding. His wife, Elin, wrapped their youngest boy in 2 quilts and still woke to find frost on the blanket edge. A water dipper left near the wall grew a gray skin of ice before breakfast. By February, Their woodpile was a scraped patch of snow and bark. Rhys burned fence rails, split stool legs, and the last crate they had used to carry tools west. The cabin had not failed because it was thin. It failed because the wind had been allowed to touch it. That is the part every man on the plains felt, but few men named. A log wall can slow conduction, the slow travel of heat through material. But the moment fast air runs across its outside face, the problem changes. The thin layer of slightly warmer air clinging to the wall is torn away and replaced again and again by colder moving air. That is convective heat loss. It is not cold sitting beside the house. It is cold working on the house. A 30-mile-an-hour winter wind turns every exposed wall into a surface being scrubbed. It pulls heat out of wood faster than a stove can calmly replace it. It drives through pinholes. It makes nail heads bloom white. It turns a cabin from a shelter into a leaking instrument. The settlers answered that theft with more wood. Rhys decided to answer it with stillness. He began with the north face, because that was where the worst wind came from. Then he curved the wall westward, then eastward, making a broken horseshoe around the cabin and leaving the southern side open for winter sun. He did not mortar the limestone. That was another reason men mocked him. Caleb Wren told anyone who would listen that Morgan's wall had holes large enough to hide a weasel. He was not wrong. The outer face looked rough, broken, and imperfect. The stones did not make a smooth sheet. They made a maze. But to Rhys, those holes were not flaws. They were little prisons for air. Each gap was too small and too broken to allow a real current to form. Air could enter the wall, but it could not travel freely through it. It was chopped, stalled, and trapped in hundreds of dead pockets. The wind could strike the outside of the wall with its full fury, but the wall did not pass that fury along. It ate it. By late October, the structure stood 7 feet high. It was nearly 4 feet thick at the bottom and narrowed as it climbed. Between its inner face and the cabin logs, Rhys left a clean 22-inch lane. Not enough for a horse, not enough for storage, enough for air to be caught and kept quiet. The neighbors saw a useless alley. Rhys saw the most important room on the claim. The work cost him almost everything that season. He lost days hauling stone when other men were cutting hay. He lost help for the barn because Wren's jokes had made him an object lesson. Men who might have traded labor suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Elin never asked him to stop. She watched him come in each night with his shoulders trembling from the pull of the stone boat. She washed grit from the cracks in his hands. When he sat too tired to eat, she put the spoon in his fingers and waited. One evening, when the first hard frost silvered the grass, she stepped into the narrow lane between stone and log and stood there listening. Outside the wall, the wind pressed and worried at the plane. Inside the lane, the air was strange. Not warm, not yet, just quiet. Elin put her palm on the cabin log. For the first time in that season's cold, it did not feel like the outside of a coffin. She looked at Rhys. "This is what you heard in your head," she said. He nodded. The first test came with a false mercy. In mid-January, a warm Chinook rolled down from the mountains and turned the snowfields to mud in 2 days. Men grinned at the sky and opened doors that had been sealed with rags. Children ran bareheaded through slush. Even Caleb Wren joked that Morgan's stone pen might make a fine place to grow cabbages. Then the wind stopped. The silence lasted half a day. By evening, the temperature had fallen below zero. By midnight, it was 20 below. Before sunrise, it touched 31 below, and the northwest wind returned with a clean, murderous steadiness that drove snow crystals sideways like filings from a saw. For 6 days, the plains became a machine. At Amos Keel's cabin, the fire was kept so large that sparks crawled up the chimney all night, yet the children slept in boots. The inside of the door frame glittered with frost. A nail driven above the bed carried a white bead of ice thick enough to snap off with a fingernail. Amos was a careful builder. His logs were good. His chinking was fresh. It did not matter. The wind found the cabin and worked on it until every wall became a drain. At the Morgan cabin, the sound was different. The gale did not vanish. It became distant, blunted, held one step away from the house. The little iron stove burned on a low draft. Not a roaring fire, not a desperate one. A kettle kept steam at its lip. Ellen's hand stayed warm enough to mend a shirt. The children's slate pencils did not freeze to their fingers. On the table, a tallow candle stood straight. Rhys watched it for a long time. A year earlier, that flame had accused him. Now, it simply burned. The cabin was not tropical. It was not a miracle. It was 61 degrees near the table, while the world outside tried to cut men open. That number mattered because it was ordinary. Ordinary was the triumph. A room where children could sleep without coats. A floor where water stayed water. A wall that no longer felt like it belonged to the storm. On the third morning of the freeze, Caleb Wren rode out to inspect a disputed boundary line he had promised to settle before spring. His horse fought the wind so hard that ice formed at the corners of its eyes. Wren wrapped his scarf across his face until only a slit remained. Near Morgan's claim, the horse shied toward the limestone wall and stopped behind it. Wren cursed and pulled the rein. The animal did not move. It stood in the wall's lee with its head lowered, suddenly calm. Wren dismounted to drag it forward, and the moment his boots touched the sheltered side of the wall, he felt the difference. Not warmth, that would have been easy to understand. Absence. The wind was gone from his body. On one side of the wall, the plane was screaming. On the other, his coat stopped snapping. His eyes stopped watering. He could hear the leather creak in the saddle. He stepped closer to the 22-inch lane between the wall and the cabin. The snow inside it lay soft and nearly undisturbed. The inner face of the limestone was dry. The cabin logs beyond it carried no glittering frost. Wren pulled off one glove and pressed his bare palm against the inner log. He expected the hard bite of frozen pine. He felt cold wood. Only cold. Not the active, burning cold he knew from every other exterior wall on the plains. Just a slow, dull cold that seemed to have lost its teeth. Then he noticed the lantern. Rhys had left a small storm lantern hanging on a peg inside the lane, used when checking the wall after dark. Wren lifted it down and tipped it. The lamp oil moved. Slowly, thickly, but it moved. Wren opened his own saddlebag, took out the small oil flask he carried for field work, and turned it upside down. Nothing came out. The oil in his flask was a waxy plug. He looked at the lantern, then at the wall, then at the thin smoke from Morgan's chimney. The smoke rose straight for several feet in the protected air above the cabin. At the height of the stone wall, it bent violently sideways and disappeared into the gale. That was the lesson drawn in gray. Below the wall line, stillness. Above it, theft. Caleb Wren stood there, with his bare hand going numb, and understood that the man he had mocked had not built badly. He had built in layers of reality. The outside world belonged to the storm. The narrow lane belonged to still air. The cabin belonged to the family. And each layer made the next one easier to defend. That afternoon, Wren went to the Keel cabin, not to finish the boundary argument, but to get warm. Amos Keel had a fire roaring and still wore a coat indoors. His wife had moved the cradle into the center of the room because the wall side was too bitter for the baby. Wren did not begin with an apology. Men on the plains rarely knew what to do with those. He began with the lantern. He set Morgan's lantern on the table and his own oil flask beside it. He tipped the flask. Nothing moved. Then he tipped the lantern. A slow amber tongue of oil crawled along the glass. Amos stared. Wren said, "His wall does not warm the house. It keeps the wind from being able to cool it." That sentence traveled farther than the joke had. A week later, 2 cattle hands rode to Morgan's place and asked how wide he had left the lane. Rhys told them 22 inches, but said the exact number was not magic. Too narrow, and moisture would have no room to settle and dry. Too wide, and the captured air could begin to move in its own lazy currents. "What matters," he said, "is that the wind spends itself before it finds the logs." By the next autumn, 3 line cabins had low stone screens on their north faces. One family used river cobble, another used broken sandstone. A sheep outfit near Horse Creek built a crescent wall around the bunkhouse and found that the stove no longer needed feeding every hour through the night. Nobody called it thermodynamics. They called it Morgan's Hush. Some called it the storm room. The name was plain enough for men who did not care for theory, and accurate enough for the ones who did. What Rhys Morgan had built was an early frontier cousin of a principle modern builders still use. Separate the weather skin from the living wall. Stop moving air before it reaches the structure. Let a cavity, a gap, or a dead air space interrupt the path between weather and warmth. A modern cavity wall does it with brick, sheathing, membranes, and measured ventilation. A rain screen does it behind cladding. A double wall does it with insulation and careful air control. Rhys did it with limestone, gravity, and the memory of wind over Welsh hills. He did not defeat winter by making the cabin stronger in the way his neighbors expected. He did not seal every inch of the world out. He did not try to answer a moving enemy with a larger flame. He changed the fight. The settlers thought cold was the enemy. Rhys knew motion was the enemy. So he gave the motion somewhere to die. That is why the wall had to stand away from the house. That is why the gaps inside the stone mattered. That is why the narrow lane, the part everyone laughed at, became the heart of the invention. The empty space was not wasted. It was working. There is a kind of knowledge that looks foolish because it does not announce itself in the language of the place where it arrives. The plains respected timber. Rhys respected air. The plains trusted fire. Rhys trusted stillness. The plains believed survival meant burning more of the world to keep one room alive. Rhys built one quiet layer between his family and the force that was actually hurting them. And when the proof came, it did not come as a lecture. It came as a straight candle, a moving thread of lamp oil, a horse choosing the lee of a wall, a chimney plume rising calmly until the storm found it again. On a treeless bench where men thought the answer to winter was always more wood, a stonemason taught them that shelter is not just what you build, it is what you keep from moving. Sometimes the strongest wall is not the one that touches the house. Sometimes the strongest wall is the one that gives the storm a place to spend itself before it ever reaches the door.